Welcome everyone to This Explainer. Today we're unpacking a truly fascinating investigation from CrowdWealth, and it asks a super relevant question. Is the modern side hustle actually a path to financial liberation, or is it just an economic smokescreen? We're going to break down the data, the history, and the psychology behind the whole gig economy. So let's dive right in. Right out of the gate, this investigation hits us with a huge paradox. Just think about it for a second. Why is it that the most productive generation in history can barely afford rent? I mean, we are living in a time where productivity is literally off the charts. Workers today, we're doing more, we're producing faster, and we're logging way more hours than any generation before us. But here's the catch. Despite all this unprecedented efficiency, millions of those exact same workers are just struggling to survive and pay their basic rent. Make it make sense, right? Well, to survive this paradox, the source points out that we're basically told to just stop sleeping, sell off our hobbies, and turn our spare bedrooms into mini hotels. And what's honestly wild about this is that it's almost never framed as a desperate measure. Instead, the mantra just became this: work, rise, grind, repeat. The investigation details how multi-billion-dollar corporations successfully took what is essentially an economic failure and totally rebranded it into this proud lifestyle choice. Working 80 hours a week just to afford groceries, yeah, that's now celebrated as the grind. So here's the core argument of our source material. This whole modern push to monetize our passions, to perfectly optimize our sleep cycles, and to turn every single waking second into a monetization strategy, it's actually an incredibly effective distraction. Sure, it looks like this massive grassroots entrepreneurial revolution, but the investigation suggests it's actually just masking systemic wage stagnation, right under the shiny banner of personal ambition. Section 1. The bait and switch, the engineering of the gig economy. To really grasp how this entire system was built, we've got to look at what the source calls the take rate trap. Back in the early 2010s, we had the hook phase. Remember that? These platforms came in looking like pure liberation. They told you, hey, be your own boss. And they offered these incredibly low platform fees, around 10%, mostly because they were heavily subsidized by massive VC funds. But as we moved down the timeline into the late 2010s, we hit the squeeze phase. Once they starved out all the traditional competition, shareholder pressure started mounting, and those low fees, they quietly jumped up to 20 or 25%. And finally, hitting the 2020s, total domination. Monopoly conditions were firmly locked in. Which brings us to this absolutely staggering number, 40%. According to the source, this is the peak extraction rate these platforms are taking today. No joke. Thanks to upgraded dynamic pricing algorithms and these mandatory promotional fee options, platforms are frequently extracting up to 40% of a transaction's total value. And when you factor in the worker actually covering their own vehicle depreciation, paying for gas, and handling self-employment taxes, well, their real take-home pay can actually plunge right below minimum wage. To put this in practical terms, the source uses this really fantastic analogy. Think about a traditional setup. A restaurant owner buys the tools, buys the ingredients, covers the rent, and then, naturally, takes the profit. But in the gig economy, it's basically like a restaurant owner telling the chef, hey, go buy your own pots and pans, get your own ingredients, cook the meal in your own home, go drop the food off yourself, and then I'm going to take a 40% cut. Oh, and the chef isn't allowed to cook for anyone else because the owner now completely controls all the customers in town. By simply classifying these workers as independent contractors, tech companies manage to offload almost all the risk while dramatically increasing their own toll. Moving on to Section 2, the macro reality, why we keep grinding. Now, you might be wondering, if the deal is genuinely this bad, why did millions of people willingly sign up for it? Well, when you look at the underlying economic data from 1979 to the present, you see this massive, historic decoupling. Thanks to computers and automation, worker productivity just shot up like a rocket. We're talking an increase of almost 65%. But, and here's the kicker, median real wages over that exact same time period stayed nearly flat. They grew only 14.8%. Basically, all that incredible wealth generated by worker efficiency, it simply didn't translate into bigger paychecks. The math just fundamentally stopped working. Because a single 9-to-5 job could no longer support a basic middle-class existence, this immense economic pressure just started building up. And the investigation notes something super interesting here. It was exactly at this peak boiling point that corporate interests heavily deployed the whole side hustle narrative. It served as this brilliant psychological distraction, essentially rebranding a massive economic crisis into a badge of honor. Section 3. The global contrast, a policy choice, not an inevitability. We often just accept this hustle culture as if it's some inevitable law of modern nature. But the source argues that it's actually a highly engineered environment. For example, look at le droit à la déconnexion, or the right to disconnect. Back in 2017, France actually codified this into law. It is a strict legal requirement that forbids employees from sending or answering professional emails or any digital notifications outside of defined working hours. They looked at the exact same gig economy, the exact same smartphones we all use, and they decided, you know what? Human sanity and free time are actual resources worth protecting by federal policy. Building on that, you see these incredibly strict protections popping up all across Europe. Companies with over 50 workers actually have to define off-hour protocols. It is literally illegal and carries heavy corporate fines to message workers on the weekend or after hours. Plus, gig platforms in several regions over there have been forced to classify workers as full employees, complete with baseline wages and paid leave. The crucial takeaway from the source here is really eye-opening. The American hustle or starve paradigm, it's a deliberate policy choice, not just some natural byproduct of living in the modern world. And that brings us to Section 4, the mental enclosure, the deepest cost of the hustle. This source argues that the most sinister cost of this whole system goes way, way deeper into our human psychology. Let's look at history for a second. Back in the day, feudal lords practiced something called enclosure. They would literally fence off public woods so peasants couldn't hunt or forage for free, forcing them into total dependence on the landlord. Well, the source compares this directly to a modern mental enclosure. By constantly convincing you that every single second of your free time absolutely must be optimized for production, side hustle culture is effectively fencing off your own mind. It's destroying the very concept of unmonetized space. And the psychological impact of this is pretty devastating. When a hobby becomes a business, the inherent joy of creation just kind of dies under the weight of all those metrics. The source uses this really great example. Let's say you love baking. Well, suddenly you no longer bake bread just because you love the quiet, relaxing feeling of kneading dough. Nope. Instead, you're baking bread while furiously calculating the cost of your ingredients, staging the perfect aesthetic photos for Instagram, and stressing out over customer retention. Your brain is literally never allowed to just rest. It is forced into this perpetual state of corporate performance. All of this leads to what is probably the source's most provocative claim. Think about it. Who actually benefits from a society that has zero free time? Existing power structures. The investigation argues that tired, exhausted workers simply lack the mental bandwidth to look up and realize that the system is broken. Hyper-isolated workers who are spread across 4 different microjobs, well, they can't exactly organize easily, can they? 80-hour workweeks effectively prevent anyone from questioning the status quo. So in this view, your burnout isn't just a byproduct of the gig economy. Actually, it's the protective armor of the system itself, keeping people way too busy just surviving to ever threaten the way things are. I want to end on this incredibly powerful philosophical question from the source material. The next time you feel guilty for just, sitting on your couch reading a book without generating any revenue, I want you to ask yourself, is that an organic human emotion? Or is it just a corporate software script running in your head? The source challenges us to realize that true wealth isn't really measured by how many income streams you have. It's measured by how much of your own life you actually own. It's the ability to look at the clock and say, this hour belongs completely to me, and it is absolutely not for sale. I really hope this explainer gave you some fascinating insights to help rethink how we view our time, our labor, and our right to just rest. Keep learning, keep questioning, and I'll see you in the next one.